I'm a wild-eyed romantic and I'm drowning in my carelessness.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Dayenu's presentation of Beyond the Count, Perspectives and Lived Experiences of Jews of Color from the Jews of Color Initiative. I'm Sumner, the Young People Organizer at Dayenu. If this is your first time at a Dayenu event, welcome. We're Dayenu, a Jewish call to climate action. Our mission is to secure a just, livable, and sustainable world for all people for generations to come by building a multi-generational Jewish movement that confronts the climate crisis with both spiritual audacity and bold political action. We are so glad that you're joining us from all over the country, continent, and globe tonight for this impactful event. It falls at the close of a difficult month for communities of color, with the death of Tyree Nichols and Lunar New Year mass shootings reminding us that our work towards a more just and equitable world is never done. Yet we are marking the beginning of a new month with hope. We turn our eyes to February as Black History Month and the start of our series on the intersection between climate justice and racial justice, because climate justice is racial justice, the right for everyone to a clean, healthy, and safe place to live, work, learn, play, and pray. Tonight, we are here to immerse ourselves in how multifaceted our Jewish community is, that we are a complex tapestry of color, gender, age, and everything else bound together by our shared culture and values. It is imperative to acknowledge that Jews of color, or JoCIs, are not a separate part of our community, but our friends, our classmates, our spouses, our rabbis, and even ourselves. Hi. We are ingrained into the Jewish community. What affects the communities of color inherently affects the Jewish community. We do our climate work at Dayenu not just to benefit future generations separate from us, but to remedy the existing crisis that is felt acutely today, from higher rates of asthma due to pollution to oil drilling mere feet from their houses, all felt by JoCIs that are within us, the Jewish community. Before we jump into our program, a little housekeeping. At the bottom of your screen, there's a button that says closed caption. To access closed captioning, click that button and click show subtitle. Please note that we are also recording tonight's program. It may be uploaded to our YouTube channel for posterity, so feel free to have your cameras off during the presentation if you do not wish to appear in the recording. We are joined tonight by Arya Marvazy of JoCI to present Beyond the Count, preceded by a kavanah or intention by Rav Tiferet Berenbaum. Arya and Rav will be joining our panel, along with Maetal Gerson of the Chicago EcoJews Circle, which will be moderated by Ginna Green. After the Q&A panel, there will be a breakout to discuss learnings from the night and our personal part in combating racism, both inside and outside of the Jewish community. Finally, we'll come together for a closing and next steps. I invite you to think throughout tonight's program about how you can take what we discuss and make it actionable in your portion of the Jewish community. With that, I turn it over to Rav Tiferet for a kavanah.
Thank you so much. Just want to make this gallery view because I love to see the faces of who's in this room, in this giant room with me. What a beautiful opportunity to have a conversation like this one. As we just said, it's the beginning of Black History Month. Today, we watched the funeral. I watched it here in the sanctuary. We're in the midst of a lot of gun violence, a lot of hate. So it's so important that we're having this conversation here tonight with open minds and open hearts. Life in the United States is an interesting challenge for the Jewish people because of race. In other countries where Jews have lived, Jews have often been just Jews, regardless of skin color, still oppressed, but not because of skin color per se. However, here in the United States, some Jews have become, quote, conditionally white. And we can no longer speak about the Jewish experience because in the United States, Jews are experiencing the US in many different ways. The Torah in Exodus 23:9 warns the Israelites, "V'ger lo tilchatz v'atem yadatem et nefesh hager ki gerim hayitem be'eretz Mitzrayim." Do not oppress a stranger, for you know the soul of the stranger. For you were strangers in the land of Egypt. We'll read that shortly in our Parsha cycle. This is one of the 36 times that the Torah is telling us to be kind and inclusive to people who are marginalized, not because it's the right thing to do, but because we know the experience of marginalization, of being made to feel other, less than. We know it from Mitzrayim. We know it from the Inquisition in Spain. We know it from the pogroms in Europe. We know it from the Holocaust. We know it from restricted housing in this country. We know it from signs that say, no Jews allowed. Va'atem yadatem et nefesh hager ki gerim hayitem. You were strangers. You were marginalized. This is the central narrative of the whole Jewish people. Tonight, we get to hear how a culture rooted in colonialism that normalizes all things associated with white culture and whiteness, and that devalues things that do not fit that standard, such as Judaism and Jewishness, which do not fit that standard, how that has impacted Jews. And it's not just non-white Jews who have suffered, but conditionally white Jews as well. Hopefully tonight we'll make that clear, how white culture leads all of us to unconsciously participate in racial marginalization, similar to what we've experienced, similar to what is our core Jewish narrative. It's hard to hear, it's hard to believe, it's hard to sit with, it's hard to feel, even it's hard to say. I feel it in my body as I'm saying it. One thing, though, that I love about Yom Kippur is that it pretty much begins with forgiveness. After we chant Kol Nidre, the liturgy, in God's voice says, Salachti kidvarecha. You're forgiven about these things that you've spoken about. And it's this forgiveness, this acceptance that allows us to then go into Yom Kippur to do the work that's needed to create change. So tonight, we're forgiven. We're all forgiven for being socialized to a culture that devalues Jewishness and non-whiteness. We're forgiven for what we didn't know and what we don't know still. We're forgiven for what we've said and what we didn't say. And with that forgiveness, that acceptance, we can do the work. Tonight, we're here to consider how we use this knowledge, how we use this newfound energy to strengthen a Jewish climate movement. The climate crisis is just that. It is a crisis. And we know that each of us has the power to change in our bubbles and our spheres of influence something. So hopefully tonight our hearts will be open, our minds will be open, and we'll receive the energy and the lift that we need to make that change where we are. Together we do this work. We're not alone. Together we're stronger.
Thank you, Rav Tiferet, for that beautiful Kavanah. I appreciate it so much. And now I'm going to introduce Arya Marvazy of JoCI to do our presentation. Arya is the Senior Director of Programs at the Jews of Color Initiative. He is a first-generation American born to Iranian Jewish immigrants from Tehran. For nearly 15 years, Arya has cultivated his leadership in Jewish communal service at Hillel on campus, Hillel International, and JQ International. A proud queer Jew who's passionate about empowering diverse Jewish identity, enriching equitable Jewish community, and ensuring inclusive pathways towards Jewish continuity. Arya has also served as a lay leader with other Jewish orgs, including JDC Entwine, JPro, AJC, Schusterman's ROI Community, and others. Arya earned his BA in psychology at the University of California, San Diego, and a master's in organizational behavior at New York University. Arya, I am so excited to learn about this report from you. Take it away.
Thank you. Thank you so very much to the entire Dayenu team. I want to give gratitude to Vicky Kaplan in the background, who's been working with me for months on this. Sumner, for your partnership and your heart-opening foundation to the evening, and Rav Tiferet, to your soulful wisdom and intention setting. Gratitude to all of you. I'd be remiss not to also mention our wonderful CEO and founder, Ilana Kaufman, who by virtue of her leadership, would make it possible to have this discussion. And I really want to give a shout out to Jade Groupman, our program associate, who's behind the scenes, who also helped to bring this to life. So much gratitude to everyone. Hi again, my name is Arya Marvazy, and I'm grateful as a team member at the Jews of Color Initiative, what you'll often hear me tighten to JoCI heretofore, to bring my own unique racial, cultural, and communal leadership lens to this conversation as a proud Iranian-American Jew of color and child of immigrants and refugees of the Islamic Revolution in Iran in 1979. So I'm going to take us through a presentation about the Jews of Color Initiative's Beyond the Count report. It is the second body of research that our organization commissioned, the first of which was Counting Inconsistencies in 2019. And Counting Inconsistencies at that time was commissioned. It was a meta-analysis of 25 national and communal level Jewish population studies, helping us understand just how many Jews of color are there. And through that first body of research, which is available on our website, we estimated that out of the 7.2 million Jews in the US, at least 12 to 15% of those identify as Jews of color. That's over 1 million, 1 in 7. And we think we have a sort of strong inkling that this too is an undercount based on how data representation was collected for JOCs. Another very big sort of data piece that sets the stage for Beyond the Count is just these two higher level pieces of information that are reality and not, subjective. One being that younger American Jewish households are increasingly multiracial. And that just tracks with almost every major population study in the United States, that as successive cohorts replace older ones, multiracial families replace less multiracial families. And that too, that by birth cohort, the percentage of Jews of color has risen consistently as per data point number 1. So now, Beyond the Count, this would be the perspectives and lived experiences of Jews of color. And what I'll say before diving into about 30 minutes of data and content on this is that the aspiration is we'll leave you with a lot more questions than answers. The full study is available online at jewsofcolorinitiative.org. Ilana always says we invite you to cozy up to it with a cup of tea, a glass of wine, whatever your drink or beverage of choice is, to really sort of soak this all in. But we're going to do a sort of high-level review of that data together. So as a welcoming for today's conversation, I give you these pieces. That one, it is both about teaching and learning. After I present, we'll have a panel of JOCs that will both speak to more of Dayenu's specific work in the climate justice space and also JOCI's work and our experiences respective to us as individuals as Jews of color. Naming that, of course, not a single one of us represents the perspectives of all JOCs whatsoever. We want you to think about these major, I'm going to go back to why we commissioned Beyond the Count. So JOCI, the organization, our sort of major outputs fall into 3 buckets of work for the US Jewish communal ecosystem. One of those is running the nation's only philanthropic fund focused on Jews of color, and that is specifically focused on funding areas that are essential to Jewish communal life and focused on field building. Those are things like leadership development, identity development, project incubation. The second part of JOCI's work is the commissioning of research that we know is important for the Jewish communal ecosystem, and that's what we'll be talking about today. And the third is that we build the field actively through opportunities like this evening in educational engagements, the production of resources like our new Racial Equity Informed Philanthropy Guide, created in partnership with Slingshot, and that is also available online, and through other programs like JOCI's Leadership Fellowships and Project Incubator. So Beyond the Count specifically was commissioned to respond to communal wonder about what are the actual experiences of JOCs, an abbreviation for Jews of color, and what can we learn from that data? Knowing, of course, that it is going to be the data that may inform how funding then informs better experiences and more productive and more profound and more inclusive and embracing experiences moving forward. So we offer these as essential anchors and questions for you all as you listen to the data that I'll go through today. Who are you in the Beyond the Count research? Are you a JoCI that might be able to identify with some of what's shared on the screen? Are you a white colleague or community member that feels responsible to help make a difference and to see change happen, to better embrace, understand the experiences of, and make the Jewish communal sector more reflective of the multiracial, multi-ethnic reality of Jewish life? How might the experiences energize your work? We know that some of the data that I'll share today is going to be challenging to hear. How might that move you to action? So this is what we sort of offer you as a lens to sit with. And of course, again, at the end of the call, we'll be broken up into small groups to be able to have a larger discussion about what we can do with our own respective spheres of influence, the people, the communities, the audiences that we may have an opportunity to either educate, inspire to action, or learn with and among. So just very high level, what was the methodology of Beyond the Count? We surveyed over 1,100 respondents, all of whom self-identified as Jews of color. Beyond that larger survey, there were also 61 direct interviews with Jews of color. What you see on the slide is that breakdown of how those 61 sort of fell into categories. Nearly 40 of those were JoCI professionals and lay leaders, which is interesting. They're giving a perspective of both a Jew of color within the ecosystem and one that's also contributing to the ecosystem from a leadership lens. Others would have been stakeholders. Key stakeholders may be lay leaders, funders, and others. And some were part of that Count Me In survey from Counting Inconsistencies. So what we say about the Beyond the Count data set is that while it's not a representative study, you can't say because there is this data that it reflects the experiences of all, but we know that it's a snowball study and that it captures many of the larger reflections of the communal field and JoCIs within it. And so we know that that in and of itself is, of course, of great value to all of us. I want to take a moment to talk about the term Jews of color. So one, we recognize at the Jews of Color Initiative and as JoCIs, of course, that race in and of itself is a social construct. It has been used for all of time to both oppress people and to empower others. And we recognize that the term itself is an imperfect term, but it is an umbrella term that does offer some value given the experience of race is real and the experience of racism is real, even between and amongst Jews who intersect with whether they understand their Judaism as a racial identity, an ethnic identity, a cultural identity, rather strictly a spiritual identity. So it's a way to name and give voice to the experiences of a diverse population of Jews whose racial identities have been historically marginalized and excluded in the race-based structures of the United States. That, of course, includes the larger Jewish communal ecosystem. And so utilizing the term Jews of color, of course, begs the question, what do we mean when we say white Jews? So, and again, I want to sort of name off the bat, because it comes up so often and it's relevant for us. In the eyes of a white supremacist, a Jew is a Jew of color. That is to suggest that in the eyes of white supremacy, all Jews are non-white. We understand, and we know, of course, one, we are not building in the eyes of white supremacists whatsoever. Two, whiteness and the experience of whiteness is real. The privileges that come along with whiteness are real. And thus, we are utilizing these terms, Jews of color and white Jews, sort of operationally for sake of the real experiences of Jews within the Jewish communal ecosystem in the United States. In this research I'm naming out loud, white Jews describes Jewish people of European descent whose physical features and lived experiences align most with the collective US racial category of white, and who generally benefit from the privileges of whiteness in the United States. I have a sense we'll pull this apart in the panel, and so please, by all means, do send your questions into the Zoom chat and we will attempt to address as many as possible. So who did Beyond the Count sort of survey and whose perspectives were embedded herein? So in this study, when we said Jews of color, we matched those categories up against the US racial categories of color, that is people of color, that is non-white, Hispanic, or Latino, or Latinx, Black or African American, American Indian or Alaskan Native, Asian, Native, Hawaiian, or other Pacific Islander, or multiracial. I want you to sort of hold that thought about multiracial identity as we come to some understanding about who else answered the questions and how they identify. What was not captured herein, and what I know that people will be thinking about, myself as a Mizrahi Jew that identifies as a Jew of color, is that Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews were not counted in Beyond the Count as JOCs, because what we understood was there are individuals who do identify with that terminology, and there are people that don't identify with that terminology. And that's okay by us. For us, we think about Jews of color as individuals who have Jewish individuals who have a racialized experience in an American political context. And again, that's a self-identified term. And so it is a self-selected term. And I hope that is clear to everyone. Here is the realities by the numbers. This speaks a bit to some of the data from counting inconsistencies, and that ends up getting sort of, you get that colored in by Beyond the Count and what's presented. There are 1 million Jews in the United States who are non-white people of color, otherwise known as Jews of color. That puts that category somewhere in the 8 to 20%. Our statistics say 12 to 15%, and we recognize that we believe that's an underestimate. We, again, the Jews of Color Initiative, a quite small shop going on about 7 years of existence in any form, were able to get over 1,100 respondents to a survey, which becomes the largest data set and largest body of research on Jews of color and their experiences. We know that if we were to be able to reach and cast the net much further, reach much further and cast that net further, we would probably have a much better understanding of just how many JOCs there are. But the numbers break down to 1 in 5 Jewish families in the United States being multiracial. That doesn't mean that every person in the household is multiracial or that every person in the family is. It means that the family has non-white people within it. And that's an important data point. The staggering percentage of Jews of color who throughout Beyond the Count express that they have experienced discrimination, racism, or in essence, a negative experience in Jewish communal life at 80% should floor you. I know that it floored us, but again, also as an individual who's experienced that racism, and we'll talk about it during the panel, it's not shocking, it should be, and this number is one that we want to be working against every single day. When JoCI makes a long-term commitment to build the field for Jews of color and empower Jewish leadership, JOC leadership, multiracial and multi-ethnic leadership to be at the future of Jewish life, that's because this is not a number or a percentage that we can stand or that we can allow in this work. 13% of Jews of color are the ones who believe that leaders are adequately responding to racism. Flipped, that is 87% of JOCs believe that leaders are inadequately responding to racism. And again, another staggering number, which is 0.01% of Jewish communal leaders across the entire Jewish communal landscape are people of color. Now, if we make up at minimum 12 to 15% of the population of American Jews, and we're making up less than 0.01% of Jewish communal leadership, we hope the gap and the need for this work and the understanding of these sort of staggering numbers to be quite important. So we're going to go into a bit of the interview characteristics before going into the experiences. What's really powerful about, again, a small shop like JoCI doing a body of research like this is that we actually reached Jews of color in all but 3 states. You'll see, of course, that as it is in terms of population centers, and again, multiracial and multi-ethnic communities, those fall mostly on the coast, the West Coast and the East Coast. 259 out of about 1,100 were in the state of California alone, where there is one of the largest hubs of Jews of color. And again, if you look at New York and in that concentration of the East Coast states, you find that next sort of larger concentration of JOCs. Begs the question, what does it look like to cast the net broader and further if we were able to get everything but Wyoming, North Dakota, and Missouri reflected in just this study. Here's some of the data about intersecting identities that were reflected in Beyond the Count respondents. Over 80% of respondents completed a college degree. We want to name that it is a very highly educated population that was responding to the survey. More than half of the respondents are in their 20s and 30s. Not causational, but a question comes up about whether that is reflective of this trend that with every next generation, you have more multiracial and multi-ethnic people. And so young adults, both experiencing multiracial life and identifying as Jews of color in a more concentrated way. There's a piece about more of the respondents identifying as women, 674 out of 1,100. And interestingly, 15% of respondents identified as being differently abled or as a person who has a disability. What does that say about how we serve Jews of color? We know, for example, I mean, even just at the initiative, in every possible publicly facing engagement, we are going to ask, what are the potential accommodational needs that an individual might have that we should be taking into consideration based on this piece of data alone? And so we name it to both educate the field about that piece as well. About race, this speaks percentage-wise to who showed up in each category. So the largest category of respondents identified as Black, African, or African American, that was 235 individuals. That next largest category, Hispanic or Latino or Latinx. And then we have Asian, Asian American, Middle Eastern and North African, and onward. Interesting to name, 12 respondents also pick the category of white or European American. But I would say the largest piece of data from this slide is actually that more than a third of respondents, 45% of those, selected 2 or more categories. This lines up very much with our understanding of both the younger demographic that showed up disproportionately in the study and the fact that there is a multiracial, a greater affiliation with multiracial identity within that category. And so 2 races selected made up 36% of participants. That was 400. 3 or more races selected made up about 100 of our participants. How do we think about that as it relates to JoCI identity? And here's a piece about authenticity, ethnicity, that was very interesting. I will only speak for myself that in my own 15 years of Jewish communal service in the ecosystem, I remember hearing the term Ashkenormativity and thinking about Ashkenazi identity as attached to whiteness. And here we see that over 42% of respondents actually identify as, they're of course JoCs responding to this survey, but they identify as Ashkenazi. And so it sort of put the idea on its head that there is a parallel assumption to be made between a racial identity and one's ethnic connection to Judaism, be that Ashkenazi, Sephardi, Mizrahi, or otherwise. And we think that's a very interesting sort of piece of data that came out of this that was a bit unexpected. The other piece is that 85% of the JoCs who responded to the survey identified very well with Judaism as a culture rather than a people, a religion, or an ethnicity. A culture and a peoplehood came up most for the respondents in Beyond the Count. And it was when that question was asked, how well do each of the following terms describe what being Jewish means to you? Again, a culture and a peoplehood, more so than a religion or an ethnicity, which we found interesting. A bit about family background, and then another piece of data that we think is important to name out loud. Often we get the question about Jews of color with people's sort of lack of understanding or exposure to Jews of color. How did those Jews of color become Jewish? How did they find their way to Judaism? They couldn't possibly have been born Jewish. Here we have data that communicates 64% of our respondents were raised with Jewish parents. That's 22% with 2 Jewish parents and 42% with 1 Jewish parent. Above that, you see sort of how individuals were raised Jewish or raised Jewish and something else, respective to the caretakers in their home. So for example, in that top bar, 49% of individuals were, 50% of individuals were raised Jewish, 16 of those were raised Jewish and something else. That brings us again to over 65% of our respondents raised Jewish. And it's an important piece of data, in particular for our white colleagues, our white community members, who I think sometimes ask that question about how is it that JOCs found their way to Jewish life, with no understanding, of course, that Black, Brown, Asian, Native American, Middle Eastern, Latino, and all other formations of Jewish people have existed since the dawn of time. And here comes the sort of crux of our content, where we'll spend the next 10 or so minutes, which is the actual experiences and perspectives of those JOCs who responded to our survey. First and foremost, this piece about where the JOCs who responded to Beyond the Count participated in Jewish communal life. One of the most important elements on this slide as you look through it is that this actually aligns very much with the broader Jewish communal ecosystem in terms of how all Jewish individuals identify with Jewish communal life. By that I mean, if you were to put this same data up against a subset of white young adults, who are like the predominant body that answered Beyond the Count, it would also be these different Jewish activities and organizations that would make up their connection to Jewish life, Jewish identity, Jewish community, and the Jewish communal ecosystem. The first of which is a formal Jewish education. So we see that 21% had that formal Jewish education or participated in that. That's over 1 in 5. 14% often had that sort of connection to a formal Jewish education, and 8% sometimes did. Collectively, again, we're looking at over half of our respondents having some connection to Jewish Jewish education as a part of their upbringing over the course of their lives by the time they responded to this survey. The other major touch points for the survey respondents were engagement with a synagogue or temple, engagement with a Jewish youth group, a Jewish overnight camp, travel to Israel, and then we see a bit less identity with or experience with things like a Jewish community center, an independent Jewish spiritual center, or a JOC organization, which is an interesting point, which very, very few JOC respondents, over 1,100 responded, and very few had any engagement with a JOC organization. And you'll see why that is problematic as it relates to creating meaningful Jewish experiences for Jews of color. For this few to have ever had an experience with with an organization that is focused on Jews of color, or specifically serving Jews of color as a part of their mission or vision. So the question here was, and what the slide presents is, we asked sort of, Jewishness is most connected to what for you? It is, what were the expressions of Jewish identity that are very important to you? And people were able to rank what of these Jewish expressions, sort of expressions of Jewish identity, were more or less important to them. What's really important, and that I want to name for a Dayenu community that is, of course, focused on climate action, focused on social justice, focused on repairing the world, is that over 75% of respondents felt that working for justice and equality, tikkun olam, or repairing the world in English, was a very important expression of Judaism for them. And that is to say that we can make an assumption that social justice efforts, social justice focused Jewish organizations may find a greater interest from Jews of color, who can say flat out, social justice work is important to us, equity work is important to us, working for a more just, inclusive, embracing world is important to us. The other 4 pieces, passing on Jewish identity to the next generation, I'll stop on that for a moment. The important piece about that, which 67% of respondents said was important to them, it was an important expression of Judaism for those JOCs to say, we want to pass our Judaism on, is that you would need to have some level of formal Jewish education, some ritual Jewish training or experience to be able to pass it on, right? A sense, a concrete understanding of and capacity to articulate Jewish values. And so it's important for us to understand these JOCs have those things and find it important for them to pass it on to the next generation. The next few highest value expressions of Judaism, or most important, that show up, those are again all the bars in dark green, are honoring our parents, grandparents, and our ancestors, remembering the Holocaust, and celebrating Jewish holidays. Again, what's interesting about this data point is that up against a comparison to Pew, which didn't ask sort of, are you a Jew of color, or are you a non-Jew of color, a white Jew or otherwise identified Jew? These data points sort of reflect some of the same trends in terms of expressions of Judaism that are important to young adults in the larger Jewish community, these top 5 pieces. We're going to talk a bit about JOC experiences in Jewish spaces. I want to name that we're coming somewhere towards the end of our presentation. And again, this is just scratching the surface of everything in the study. Another sort of invitation to please take some time. In the follow-up email, by the way, that will come from the Dayenu team, you will get a link to Beyond the Count. And we invite you all to look at that data a lot more intimately. The question here asks, as it relates to Jewish communal spaces, how often, if at all, is it difficult for your various identities to coexist when you are in blank, blank, and blank Jewish spaces? So how often, if at all, is it difficult for your various identities to coexist when you are in predominantly white Jewish spaces? If we look at that first bar, right, between usually, often, and sometimes, we've got over 70%, 75% of JOC respondents saying it's difficult for our various multiracial, multi-ethnic, intersectional identities to exist in predominantly white Jewish spaces for a wide variety of reasons that we could be pulling apart. Interestingly enough, in that next bar down, even in predominantly BIPOC spaces, that's Black, Indigenous, and people of color spaces, but that are non-Jewish, we still find that in over 60% of those spaces, it's hard for Jews of color to coexist. Why? Because maybe it is harder to bring in our Jewishness or that piece of our cultural, religious, ethnic connection to Judaism into a space that may be more racially reflective of our JOC experience. How often, if at all, is it difficult for your various identities to coexist when you are in relationships with your non-Jewish family members? That's in that third row. And then in the bottom row is in your relationships with your Jewish family members. What we understand here is that, of course, when we are with our own family members and our Jewish family members, that's when we feel the least difficulty existing in our intersectional identities. The 2 data pieces on bottom are what I would point to also on this slide. One of them is nearly half of respondents articulated that they have altered how they speak, dress, or present themselves in predominantly white Jewish spaces. I invite you all to look up the term code switching about how people of color do this type of transitioning in terms of language, dress, appearance, tone, intonation, to match what they think the expected expectations of a predominantly white space might be. And over 65% of respondents saying that they have felt disconnected from their Jewish identity at times, likely as a result of this sort of incapacity to come fully aligned in all of the different facets of our intersectional identities into Jewish spaces. This doesn't have to be the case for all of time. We are working long and hard at the Jews of Color Initiative to flip this on its head. And I know that many of the JOC leaders across the Jewish communal ecosystem are working day in and day out to make this less normative. And we, of course, appreciate the funders that are working so hard to uplift and empower Jews of color and the projects that they serve. But this can't stand, right? We don't want over 75% of Jews of color to say that it's difficult for our various identities to coexist in predominantly white Jewish spaces. This is that piece that we talked about as a data point that over 80%, and I apologize, I'm looking at my timing on the right so that I wrap this up in the next few minutes. Over 80% had that negative experiences in Jewish communal life. I'm going to read these out loud because it's important for us to hear them as a collective and we can process in the panel. 75% said others have made assumptions about me based on my skin tone. That's over 1,000 of the respondents. Nearly 75% said I have felt burdened with explaining myself and my identity. 66%, I have been asked questions about my race or my ethnicity that have made me uncomfortable. Noting again, these responses and these feelings are in Jewish communal settings. 63%, I have experienced stress due to being the only member of my race or identity in a Jewish communal setting. 60%, I have felt tokenized or otherwise asked to represent my people, my culture, my identities, my intersections of race or identity in a space by virtue of being the only individual or one of very few. And over nearly 60% responded that they agree or they strongly agree with the idea that I have been treated as if I don't belong in a Jewish communal setting. That's 1,031 JOCs who responded to the survey said I have been treated as if I don't belong. Why? I think we can all say loud and clear why we understand the immense value of working to work against these numbers and make our Jewish communal settings and spaces far more inclusive. This slide speaks to discrimination in Jewish settings, and I'll just sort of name what the different bars represent. The darker green bars are speaking to discrimination because of race. The middle green is discrimination because of how an individual is Jewish. And the lighter green bars are the discrimination because of another aspect of their identity. And we asked them sort of, where have you experienced discrimination? The vast majority of the respondents had experienced some level of discrimination in a Jewish spiritual community, congregation, or synagogue. Highly problematic. Others in Jewish organizations, others with Jewish schools or educational centers or by teachers in Jewish spaces. And those last two are other Jewish settings that were not listed, on organizations or groups that cater to Jews of color, where JOCs had still experienced some level of discrimination within, albeit, less than 10%, but real. This slide speaks to that data point about our sense that the leaders of the communal ecosystem are not handling the conversation about racism and white supremacy and addressing these issues well. The vast majority of individuals believe that that the Jewish communal leadership are handling it very poorly or poorly. And what's interesting is that we find in this data, in this slide, that there is a sense that Jewish communal leaders have an easier time handling racism, white supremacy external to the Jewish communal ecosystem, which we can very much unpack. This slide speaks to when and where Jews of color feel the greatest sense of connection. And it is whether the top of it is showing that greatest alignment, and that reflects when respondents are with their families. That is where they feel the greatest sense of connection with JOCs. And the least sense of connection or sort of alignment happens for Jews of color in predominantly white Jewish organizations. That's that number 3 at the bottom, where the respondents' sense of identity, connection, alignment is at greatest distance. 46% of respondents said talking about the experience of being a JOC with other JOCs is very important to them. Now I go back to the fact that very few of the JOCs who responded to the survey even had or ever had experiences with JOC organizations, projects, opportunities where they might have these conversations. 51% agreed that they have at times felt a sense of belonging amongst white Jews. So something is happening that would allow a JOC to say, even within this setting where there have been these hard and difficult discriminatory experiences, more than half of respondents had also felt belonging at different instances or times in their engagement with Jewish communal life across the ecosystem. And finally, 36% of respondents said they have no close friends who are Jews of color. Part of our work is about creating this much larger ecosystem, networks, offerings, opportunities that help connect JOCs across the Jewish communal field in America. And one would say there is great momentum happening there, but of course there is so much work ahead of us and so much more that should be and can be happening. So these last two slides are about key takeaways and strategies for intervention. Top 5. What we know from this data is that Jews of color have faced widespread discrimination in Jewish settings. It is not sort of up for debate. This is happening. What we know too is that one of the best things for Jews of color is that they are connecting with other Jews of color. It is vital to our well-being, to our sense of connection to Jewishness, to our sense of connection to Jewish community and continuity. Number 3, Jews of color often connect their Jewishness to a sense of justice, and with that connection of past and future, that concept of passing their Judaism on, honoring their parents and grandparents. And this is a trend in JOC connection to Jewish life. We would posit, as we think many JOCs who would be on this panel and outside of this conversation would agree with, it is time to be rid of assumptions about Jews of color, about what we do, how we do it, why we do it. It's more about understanding what are the needs of Jews of color and beginning to work with us to serve our broader communities in a way that, God willing, over time, the leadership across the Jewish communal ecosystem, the offerings and opportunities across the Jewish communal ecosystem recognize and embed a pathway for Jews of color to feel included, to feel an opportunity and a pathway to leadership, to be at the helm of leadership and development opportunities across the ecosystem. And that requires all of this ridding of assumptions about Jews of color. And finally, we have a long road ahead of us to tackle racism and white supremacy in the Jewish institutional community. It is not an easy road, it is a long one. It is a marathon, not a sprint, and we will be in this work for decades, and we are committed to be in this work with one another. And so we finally sort of offer these strategies for intervention. And of course, one could spend a full hour just pulling apart each of these. We invite you all to think about how you invest in, support, and grow Jewish leaders of color. If you are part of institutions, part of boards, part of any sort of power dynamics within Jewish communal life, thinking about how you shift power and organizational leadership to more accurately reflect the diversity of Jewish life. We ask you and we invite you to support organizations and initiatives led by and serving Jews of color. There is a whole ecosystem of us out there. Prioritize creating spaces and places for discourse and dialogue with and among JOCs, as we see that is so important for us to be with and among JOCs within Jewish communal spaces. And of course, to promote further research about JOC identity and Jewishness, because it is again from this data that we're able to say, let us move our funding or our efforts or our strategies to better deliver for our larger Jewish communal ecosystem. Thank you so much for listening to this presentation. And I am so eager to pass it back to our Dayenu team and to Ginna, who will be leading our panel on this subject.
Thank you, Arya. I know way more than I did 30 minutes ago, and it allowed me to remember back to my stats classes, which I remember so fondly. Well, we're going to expand upon what we have just learned in Arya's presentation and really lean into the lived experiences. So I'm going to introduce Ginna Green to moderate our panel. Ginna Green is a strategist, writer, movement builder, and podcaster, partner and chief strategy officer at Uprise, where she works with the good guys of all genders. A Schusterman Senior Fellow and a Jewish Orthodox Feminist Alliance notable woman, Ginna is president of the Women's March Win PAC, chair of Bend the Arc, a Jewish Partnership for Justice, and board member at the Jews of Color Initiative, Jewish Story Partners, and the Jewish Social Justice Roundtable. She is South Carolina born, raised, and returned, and the mom of 4 amazing kids, from college to 2nd grade. And she is also a Dayenu Advisory Board member. So Ginna, time for the panel.
Thank you, Sumner. And thank you, Arya, for that deep dive into the data. It's been a minute since I've seen it, and I learned something new. I remember something new every time. So I'm really excited to get into our conversation with you and our fellow panelists tonight, whom I'm going to introduce now. One of them you've already met, Rav Tiferet Berenbaum is the Rabbi of Congregational Learning and Programming at TVZ Brookline in Brookline, Massachusetts. She received rabbinic ordination as well as a Master's of Jewish Education from Hebrew College in Newton, Massachusetts, and is currently pursuing a doctorate in educational leadership at Lesley University in Cambridge. Rabbi Tiferet formerly served as Senior Rabbi and Education Director at congregations in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and in Mount Holly, New Jersey. She is a 2021 Covenant Foundation Pomegranate Prize recipient in recognition of her leadership in Jewish education. Rav Tiferet, welcome to the panel. And we've got one more panelist too, Maetal Gerson. Her is a Chicago-based community organizer. She became involved in climate justice work after participating in a nonviolent direct action with West Virginia Rising during April of 2022. She later completed the Faithful Climate BIPOC Fellowship in July of 2022, and she deeply believes in the role that community organizing work plays in creating systemic change and also in bringing communities together. Maetal works as a field organizer at the Jewish Council on Urban Affairs and as a teacher at Mensch Academy. She now serves as a leader on Chicago's Dayenu Leadership Circle. Thank you for joining us, Maetal.
Thank you so much.
All right, so folks can continue to put questions into the chat if you have them. We haven't gotten any so far. I've got plenty, so don't worry. If you don't have any questions, I got you covered. And then we will just have a great conversation for about the next 20-ish minutes with the crew. Arya, you raised up a lot of things for me, but I think the first thing I want to ask, you pointed out that the survey was 1,100 JoCI. That ain't everybody, right? So I actually want all of my panelists to talk about your Jewish lived experience and give me a minute and a half from each of you about what it has been like to be your JoCI self in Jewish space. And Arya, you were talking for a long time, and Rav Tiferet, you kicked us off. So Maetal, I'm going to give you the first mic.
Thank you so much, Gina. Yeah, and thank you for having me. I guess for me, my experience being a JoCI in Jewish space has been, I kind of came to it in college. I grew up in a community where it was predominantly white, and I always actually considered myself like Jewish. I didn't really think about really the fact that I was Asian as well, was a transracial adoptee. But when I went to college, it was like suddenly I wasn't around a Jewish community that knew me since I was little. So suddenly I kind of faced this world that like didn't know I was Jewish. And that was a very kind of hard process for me to move through, because I loved Judaism. I loved praying. I loved eating the food, I loved everything. And so it was very hard to suddenly kind of feel like a stranger in the community. And I think what this led me to, it was painful, but I think what it led me to was to connect with JoCI in Chicago, and also non-JoCI, but other people who had also felt kind of alienated from the community for various reasons. Like it became a kind of a thing that we had in common, that we could connect over, and just kind of I built really powerful and important relationships from that. It's kind of influenced my kind of view to organizing and to being in communal and Jewish spaces, that it's very important to have people who share similar experiences and who understand. And it's also so important to educate about the diversity and just the diversity of people in our communities. And you never know who might have a very similar experience to you. So yeah.
That is so true. And Arya, Maetal just like tick, tick, tick of all the things that you said. Not all the things, right? But this feeling of discrimination, finding other JoC, that importance. Tell us about you, your experience.
I'll tighten up a story in a minute and a half that is just my entry point to Jewish communal life, which is interesting. I grew up in Los Angeles in the largest population of Iranian Jews in the world. We call Los Angeles Tehrangeles because like everybody just moved from Tehran over to LA. And so what's interesting is I felt this like being a Persian Jew is so normal. What a like beautiful thing. And because I was like, I had a synagogue life and that was very Persian and Jewish and my community life was so Persian and Jewish. When I got to college, I happened upon Hillel and I understood what Hillel was offering and I was not, it just wasn't for me. Like matzo ball soup and the hymns and the sounds, nothing felt like home for me. It didn't feel like the Judaism I knew. I felt somewhat alienated that it was this Jewish flavor that was just like not at all representative of my understanding and experience of Judaism. I mean, the values were the same, but the experience was entirely different. And what Hillel did at that time was they created some internship and they used a terminology we would never use today, but they said, we are looking for Jews on the periphery. And by that, like Jews that are uninvolved, Jews that are unengaged, and we want to give them a budget to come and like sort of do something at Hillel that they feel like is missing. For me, I was like, Hillel at UC San Diego, bless you, has nothing to do with like Mizrahi and Sephardi Jewish identity. There's no sort of multiracial Jewish identity. And so it was because Hillel even offered me the in to basically bring others like me into the Hillel home, to do Middle Eastern Shabbat experiences and be my full self in my intersections, that I would now 15 years later be a Jewish communal leader. I never thought this would be my path, but it was because of that invitation that I'd be here. And that is what I think is really important for us to think about in terms of engagement from a synagogue vantage point, from a sort of communal organizational standpoint. What inroads do we create for people to bring their full selves that might lend them to then leading us as they want to lead and build what they want to build? I'll offer that.
Perfect segue to the panelist who is in a rabbinic leadership position, who has her own shul. Like, what has it been like to be a JoC through your life? And like, especially, I want to hear, what is it like to lead, I'm guessing, a mostly white congregation and or mostly white congregations? Like, can you speak a little bit to that as part of telling a little bit about your experience in Jewish space?
Yeah, gladly. And I think that really, that's like the main difference for me. Like when I think about my story and my experiences, I notice that, the times when I'm feeling the most alienated, the most marginalized in a Jewish space are often when I'm in new places where people have no idea who I am. And as soon as someone's like, oh, you're Rabbi so-and-so, like the whole thing switches, right? And so I'm like, oh, but, don't treat me differently now that you know that I'm a rabbi, treat me differently because I'm a Jew, right? Like, I don't want to like hide behind my smicha in any way. And I think about my early experiences in predominantly white Jewish spaces. I remember like applying for a job and I was definitely qualified. I had the degrees and the experience, et cetera. And the woman, she said, well, is there anything else that you want to tell me? And I was like, no, I don't think there's anything else. And she was like, are you sure there's nothing else that you want to tell me? And I was like, this woman is expecting me to tell her how I'm Jewish, right? Like she wants me to tell her my whole Jewish journey. And I was like, no, there's nothing I want to, there's nothing else, right? So obviously I didn't get the job because I didn't indulge. But whatever. So, I just remember these moments and how it's very different now because I'm usually in places where people know who I am. But in terms of leadership, it really takes a very, I don't want to even say special, but it takes a certain community that's going to be able to welcome and nourish Jews of color and the experiences that we have and the experiences that we bring. You know, my first congregation was well, I should say the congregation I'm at now is amazing. TBZ, it's where I grew up. And it's like the first place when I walked in and I was like, oh, I can just be who I am in this space. I don't have to explain that to anyone. And that's what I was used to. And that's what I expected the rest of the Jewish world to be like. It wasn't. But I found another congregation that was very similar to that. And even though it was predominantly white, there were a lot of people who were there who were very strong allies. And then it came to attract people who were also Jews of color or otherly marginalized people. So that's been very powerful for me. And to be back here and to be in a congregation that is also full of very strong allies for non-white Jews and full of also non-white Jews is really, it's really an honor to be a leader amongst these people.
TBZ, like the love is mutual is what I'm hearing, word on the street. So, okay, you said allies, lots of questions coming in about variations, right? We've got folks asking questions about, we got JoCI asking questions, should JoCI be in leadership positions at organizations? We've got folks asking, how do non-white Jews become better allies? We've got, how do we make our institutions better, which are all sort of the same question, which is like, how do, first of all, how do we make our spaces and places the kinds of spaces and places that JoCI want to be? What are, because that's going to be the first question. So we asked that, I'm going to answer the first question from the JoCI that we got in the spreadsheet, which was, should JoCI be in leadership in organizations? 100% yes, they should. And if and only if those institutions and those places are ready for them to be able to actively participate, wield their power, wield their influence, and do that. So that's the check of the question. So now, how do we get our institutions to be those places? Maetal, it's been a minute since we heard from you, so we'll have you kick it off.
All righty. I think, well, one of the things I'm thinking is that the importance of kind of having, whether it's an institution, organization, Hillel, whatever, to have kind of a culture of openness of people bringing their own experiences and stories. You know, it's very easy, especially with talking with a lot of like about identity and stuff, to rewrite people's experiences, assume people are have had a history that they haven't, and so it's really important to kind of to avoid that and to allow people to express themselves to the extent that they feel comfortable, not to kind of what Tiferet was saying, like not expect them to say their whole story, and yeah, that's one of the important ways.
Arya?
Well, in our time, I'll
right, we do have a limited time.
I'll offer a thought. I mean, what I want to say as a response to this question that just unpacks many more questions is, how ready, willing, and eager are institutional leaders to be honest about who they've engaged, why their communities have looked the way that they've looked over time, who's coming through their doors currently as a result of how they have engaged sort of a broader Jewish community, and why maybe, I'm just speaking in hypotheticals, and of course there are real examples of this, a Jewish communal board has never seen a Jew of color in their midst, period. A Hillel on campus has never seen a Jew of color as a Jewish student body president. A, sort of name the organization, name the sort of leadership dynamics, and why JoCIs have not come into those spaces. There is a honest conversation to be had about how, again, I don't believe the vast majority of people, I want to not believe the vast majority of people, it's not an express racism that would lead you there. It is an internalized and socialized racism that would allow a space to look that way and feel okay. Why should Jewish life feel okay in that monolithic, sort of less diverse universe when we know we're all here? So like my first invitation, which I know is just, again, an invitation to much, is the willingness and the eagerness to have long and hard conversations. I think, of course, and without question, a longitudinal commitment, I mean like long-term commitment to making change is the next biggest possible step. It won't happen over the course of 3 to 5 DEI trainings. It'll happen with long-term commitments to over the next 30 years, we intend on, and then permanently these become organizational policies. It's not a matter of sort of, and I've heard it done with LGBTQ equality as well. Well, we've done an inclusion training now, and now we understand how LGBTQ people feel in our midst, and so we're going to do better to address those issues. And it's like, yeah, well, it will continue to manifest in different ways unless you think about this in a more holistic way. And that means becoming a matter of organizational policy, organizational strategy, sort of organizational values. And those things become systemic in terms of, we hope, making the communal ecosystem better for Jews of color, more, I want to say sort of more exciting and more engaging for us who want to be a part of.
Who want to be a part of it. Beth, Tiferet, do you more to, because I have a question about climate. I think Arya and Maetal sort of nailed a lot there. I can move us to climate unless you have, but if you have some additions to how we can build better communities, then bring it, and then we'll move to climate.
I mean, in like 20 seconds, I'll just say what I heard you saying, Arya, is like this, what I heard in your words is this like feeling of color blindness that used to be a thing, and like that used to be the goal. And I think one of the ways that we create the kind of community that's going to be able to nourish and nurture Jewish leadership of color is seeing all of these ways that people in general are marginalized, right? If it's, you brought up like LGBTQ plus people, Black people, Latino people, like seeing that difference and like understanding what the world is for other people outside of whoever the majority is. I was from my own experience, I was in a situation where I was, working, it was all white people, all white Judaism. It's like, how am I going to thrive here? Like, why am I here? So I think that's really important, being able to see what the organization really looks like. And as you were saying, Arya, like, who have you been engaging? Who is showing up to things? And how will this realistically work?
I want to ask a climate question because I know wait, Vicky, am I done in a minute? Do I only have a minute left? Is that accurate? Give me a time check, please. Time check from Dayenu team. I just want to make sure that I'm excellent. Okay, so I got a few more questions. Great. I want to ask a couple things. So there are two questions that I know are at the top of my mind right now. I do want to ask a question about what Sumner mentioned earlier about climate justice being racial justice, and racial justice is climate justice. So I definitely want to get to that. But I also want to lift up, Arya, one of the slides that you shared was explicitly addressing Jewish communal leadership and what they're doing good at, what they're not doing good at. And one of the things that was very, very interesting, not surprising, but interesting to see, was the perception that Jewish leaders are better at addressing racism outside of the Jewish community than inside the Jewish community, and sort of what that says and means about our ability as a community to see the things that y'all just implored us to see. And so I would love to hear a little bit about that. So that's a question. And then I would also love to hear about that intersection of climate justice and racial justice and what it means for people of color to be the most burdened by the climate crisis and the folks who are least contributing to it. So I got two questions out there. This is a little, it's wild territory, but Maetal, you got motivated and mobilized by climate activism in recent years. Can you talk to us about that intersection, racial justice and climate justice, and what it looks like for you?
Yeah, sure. So for me, I think racial justice racial justice has been a lot about kind of really relationship building and like kind of creating like coalitions and building kind of trust between groups. And the exact same for climate justice. Like it really requires like grassroots organizing and like the same kind of community minded efforts and like support that racial justice. So yeah, and I think that they kind of provide really helpful models for each other. And then I also had something to say about your first, when you were talking about organizations being better at addressing racism outside than in. I that very much resonates with me. I think in my experience, like it is actually like part of the culture of white supremacy to kind of want to deal with or say, oh, look what's happening over there, and not really. I remember being, even in high school, and like there being a diversity group where teachers would nominate students, like be on it, and like everyone there was white, and I was just like, but yeah, so I think that it's it's a problem, but I do think that organizations are working to address it, at least the ones that I have been a part of, and I think that one of the ways of addressing it is that really recognizing the importance of a space for JoCI to gather and to be in a community and build that power that I was talking about, that's so important for both climate organizing and community organizing. So yeah.
Thank you. Arya, Tiferet, either or both of those sort of questions that I've put out there in terms of leadership, the ease with which we approach racial justice outside of the Jewish community versus in, and or that intersection between racial justice and climate justice and experience in the climate movement.
Yeah, I think it's a challenge to address the racism within the Jewish community. Or I should say, it's easier to address the racism outside of the Jewish community, because I think with most things, it's much easier to diagnose someone else's problem than to look internally and see what's happening. But I think also it's because of the unease that conditionally white Jews or functionally white Jews have with their whiteness and like that relationship with whiteness. And what does it mean to step into that and to perpetuate this marginalization that is very similar to one that's experienced? And I think that creates a very a dissonant experience. So I think it's much easier to do that finger pointing and looking over there instead of processing the internal experience of the experience here in America or in the United States.
And also, wouldn't it be more work for us when we look inside? Like, then it becomes more work for us because then we're not the allies. We have to do the work, right?
Yeah.
As it changes the calculus a little bit.
Yeah. And I think that goes back to, I don't remember if it was you, Ginna, or Arya, who said, like, we're not going to fix this in like 3 to 5 DEI sessions, right? Like, this is not something that we're going to learn that someone's going to give us. It's like, this is the work that we need to do to fix what's wrong here in our own houses first, before then going out to tell other folks what to do at their house.
All right. Does that resonate for, yeah.
It's what I'll just an anecdote, and I'll keep it real tight. As this sort of revolution of Black Lives Matter should come around after George Floyd's murder, and organizations across the ecosystem made these profound statements of solidarity with Black and brown people, BIPOC individuals, and with all the sort of fervor of, we believe in these values that are Jewish values, and so we will make these statements. What was the unfortunate reality that we can assess now objectively 5 years later is that, several years later, excuse me, not 5 years later, but is that very few of those institutions went about some long-term commitment to racial justice as an institution, to diversifying their leadership internally to reflect the multiracial, multi-ethnic, reality of Jewish life. There was
Mhm.
we understand, it's a sort of normative part of the human psyche, and us as Jews, even, to say, like, we believe in these values, we care about these things, we care about equity, and we do, right? But to then name that we have been inequitable, and we have been wrong, and we have been unjust, and we have treated unfairly, and people have experienced things knowingly or unknowingly at our whim as Jewish communal leaders, is the harder thing for people to accept and then take on the burden of rectifying for the future. And so that's why that I think that well, we'll make statements externally, someone's not holding us to that commitment, maybe the way that if we make those statements internally, like, X synagogue has never had a Jew of color on our board historically. We now have
Mhm.
a 5-year plan to make it so that we can engage and serve and embrace Jews of color that we know are in our midst. And that requires this different level of, oh, we're watching, we're listening, we're eager, we're sort of wanting to see that change happen over a time-bound commitment. It's different internally versus what we might say externally as an expression of solidarity.
Mm. While you still have your mic on, Arya, I got a question about the research that I think it's going to be easy for you to answer, around how did the researchers find the JoCI for the study?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. You'll get like several paragraphs on it within the actual body of research itself. But in essence, the institution existed by that point, the Jews of Color Initiative, and there was a collective of Jews of color that were brought together as a roundtable that helped the formation of this, institution come to life. And there was this sort of pushing out amongst the JoCI leadership, that's Jews of color leadership within the ecosystem, that would want to see this data come to life. And that would mean that they too were part of probably larger networks of Jews of color. So it was this sort of like passing it amongst our known communities. It made its way, of course, to social media and the broader internet, and we think some people came in from those pathways, but it was a very interpersonal web of connections that would bleed out from a core group of Jews of color and Jewish communal leaders of color that really cared about this and pushed it out as far and wide as possible. And that speaks, I think, somewhat to sort of how powerful that group can be, with more investment and empowerment.
Which is, I think, a really great note to end on. One of JoCI's interventions: more resources, more investment, more commitment. And then I think I'm going to close and just say that the fact that Dayenu exists in this moment to be a Jewish climate organizing space is like radical in and of itself, right? Like, I mean, us trying to build multi-generational, multi-ethnic, multiracial community to this fight, which you lifted up, that social justice is a big part of how JoCI see ourselves. When we think about building our Dayenu circles and doing our work on the ground, doing it in DC through our partners and allies, doing it all across the country, go back to the words that Sumner shared in the very beginning, that the work of climate justice is racial justice. They can't be disconnected. They're inextricably linked, like so many other oppressions as well that we experience, climate crisis and racism. And so I'm just gonna close off this panel time with Arya, with Tiferet, with Maetal, thanking you all for your time and energy and wisdom and presence tonight. And with that, I will hand it back to Sumner.
Thank you so much, Ginna, Arya, Maetal, and Tiferet, for having this conversation that we just don't have enough, and really humanizing the numbers that we saw on screen. Our theory of change here at Dayenu is to focus on systems change, how the big picture, our society, our laws, and our corporations enable the climate crisis. Systems change is prevalent in racial justice work too. Racism, especially in the US, is systemic, from where POC neighborhoods are located due to redlining to the generational wealth gap. However, there is also a person-to-person component to combating racism, which we'll focus on tonight in our breakout groups, in our efforts to make the Jewish climate movement an inclusive and welcoming space for Jews of color. We're going to spend some quick time in breakouts now to reflect on two core questions. One, what are the Jewish spaces that you belong to? What are your spheres of influence? And what is one even incremental way that you can share your learning or the data beyond this conversation? And why is it important for you to do so? Two, what inside of you might need some course correction? Where might you shine a light on something that is not serving you and or the Jewish people when you think about race, racism, inequity, anti-Semitism? What do you find greater proximity to or to let go of? If you identify as a person of color and would like to be in a POC only breakout room, you can rename yourself in Zoom and write POC in front of your name so that you can go there. A couple of community reminders before we send you off. One, move up, move up. Everyone talk and everyone listen. Make space for each person in your group and treat what they bring with the same reverence and respect as you have for your ideas. Two, we want this space to be as democratic as possible. This means trying to prevent any power imbalances, especially on a topic that some may feel hesitant to discuss openly. That being said, your group can also consider internally nominating a facilitator and a note taker to keep the conversation on track. We're going to drop the link to the Doodle Doc in the chat for everyone to take notes and send you off to your breakout rooms now. We're going to give a 1-minute reminder when it's time to come back together and hear about the next steps from today's program. My suggestion for a great next step is to attend the next session in this series, Building Meaningful Local Interfaith and Multiracial Partnerships for Climate Justice, an interactive workshop to hear real stories and examples directly from Dayenu Circle leaders and community partners about what it's like to build meaningful relationships and work in solidarity. A March date for the workshop will be announced soon. JoCIs in attendance tonight have an awesome opportunity to be at our inaugural Dayenu JoCI caucus on February 28th at 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific. This is a space for us to support each other as people of color in the Jewish climate movement, sharing our joys, our pitfalls, and everything in between. A registration link will be coming soon, so watch your inboxes. And speaking of inboxes, if you have more questions about what was discussed tonight, you can direct them to info@dayenu.org, and we will follow up with you individually. Also, email us with what you're doing in your community. We want to celebrate your efforts with simcha, or joy. We'll send out a resource guide this week with the full Beyond the Count study and other resources from around the Jewish community, such as the Roundtable's Racial Justice Framework and a Tu B'Shvat guide from both Jutina and Dayenu. Also, don't forget to follow Dayenu and JoCI online. Our contacts are on the screen in front of you, and our socials are @JoinDayenu and @JoCI Initiative. Thank you so much for attending, and a special thank you to our panel, Ginna Green, Arya Marvazy, Rav Tiferet Berenbaum, and Maetal Gerson. Rena Branson's L'Dor Door will send us off tonight. One of Dayenu's commissioned climate anthems, it features Jews of all colors singing together for the worlds that we want to build. I'll see you at one of our future events soon.
Generations to come demand that we act now to heal the earth for all to thrive under the sun. Let door yeah.